Gerald Ford holds a solitary, haunting record in American history. He is the only man to sit in the Oval Office without a single citizen casting a vote for him, not for president and not even for vice president. He ascended to power solely because the system failed, stepping in when both Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace. But while the voters didn't choose him, death tried to claim him. In September 1975, the accidental president became a moving target. Twice in just 17 days on the streets of California, assassins moved in. The first time, a gun pressed against his stomach jammed at the critical second. The second time, a bullet missed his skull by mere centimeters. This is the strange, violent fate of America's greatest stand-in. A man who wasn't supposed to be there, yet refused to die. The America that Ford inherited in 1974 was a place of deep atmospheric dread. It is difficult to overstate how broken the American spirit was in those gray, grim years. The Technicolor optimism of the 1950s and the radical energy of the 1960s had both drained away, leaving behind a residue of cynicism that coated everything like the cigarette smoke that filled every boardroom and diner. The economy was suffering from a mysterious new cancer called stagflation, a paralyzing combination of stagnant growth and runaway inflation that defied the textbooks of economists. The price of bread was rising, the gas lines were lengthening, and the jobs were vanishing. The great American engine had seized up. Overseas, the wound of Vietnam was still fresh and bleeding. It wasn't just a lost war. It was a humiliation that played out on the nightly news. The illusion of American invincibility had been shattered in the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, and the soldiers returning home were not greeted with parades, but with silence or scorn. The country felt old. It felt tired. It felt like a giant that had stumbled and couldn't quite figure out how to get back up. The cultural mood was one of dark nostalgia, a yearning for a past that felt simpler, coupled with a bitter realization that the innocence could never be reclaimed. Movies became grittier, music became heavier, the national conversation turned inward and sour. In this landscape of decay, Gerald Ford was an anachronism. He was a man from a different time, a relic of a Midwestern decency that seemed almost naive in the face of modern complexities. He was a pipe smoker in an era of acid trips. He was a man who believed in the handshake deal in an era of wiretaps. This dissonance was his greatest liability, but it was also the source of his peculiar strength. He didn't understand the darkness of the 1970s, which meant he wasn't afraid of it. He walked into the haunted house of the presidency and started opening the curtains, not realizing that the ghosts were not ready to leave. The press, having tasted blood with Nixon, was in a frenzy. They had realized their power. They had hunted a president to extinction, and they were not about to sheath their knives just because the new guy seemed nice. The concept of the honeymoon period was dead. Every move Ford made was scrutinized with a level of suspicion that bordered on paranoia. If Nixon was the criminal mastermind, the press began to wonder if Ford was the accomplice. The clean face put forward to hide the rotting body. Was he a puppet? Was there a secret deal? The questions swirled around him like vultures. Ford, a man who had spent 25 years in the clubby deal-making world of Congress, was unprepared for this level of vitriol. He thought he was among friends. He didn't realize that in the post-Watergate world, there were no friends in Washington, only sources and targets. There is a specific haunting quality to the loneliness of Gerald Ford in those early days. Imagine the physical sensation of sitting at the Resolute desk for the first time. The leather chair is still warm from the previous occupant. The drawers might still contain the stray paperclips or notes of a man who had just fled to avoid prison. The ghosts of the Watergate conspirators, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, seemed to linger in the corridors of the West Wing. Ford was surrounded by Nixon's staff, Nixon's furniture, Nixon's policies. He was a squatter in his own home. He had no transition team, no months of preparation to formulate a vision. He was thrown into the deep end of the pool while wearing a three-piece suit. The tragedy of Ford's position was structural. A president usually enters office on a wave of euphoria, carried by the mandate of the voters. That mandate is a shield. It protects him, gives him moral authority. Ford had no shield. He was naked before his enemies. Every time he tried to assert authority, the unspoken rebuttal from the Congress and the public was the same. Who asked you? He was the stepfather trying to discipline a rebellious teenager who screams, "You're not my real dad." This lack of legitimacy was a psychic weight that he carried every single day. It made him hesitant when he should have been bold, and stubborn when he should have been flexible. He was constantly trying to prove that he belonged, to prove that the accident of his presidency was actually a stroke of destiny. But fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor, the very qualities that made Ford attractive as a vice president. His dullness, his predictability, his lack of Machiavellian ambition were the very qualities that made him vulnerable as a president. The country, in its trauma, claimed it wanted a regular guy. They said they wanted an end to the imperial presidency. They wanted a Ford, not a Mercedes. But deep down, the American psyche craves a king. They crave majesty. They crave a figure who is larger than life. When Ford toasted his own English muffins in the morning, when he picked up his own golden retriever's waist on the White House lawn, he thought he was showing humility. But to a frightened nation, it looked like weakness. They looked at him and saw a reflection of their own diminished status. If the president is just a guy like your neighbor who mows his own lawn, then who is flying the plane? Who is keeping the wolves at bay? This psychological dissonance set the stage for the cruelty that was to come. The Klutz narrative didn't take hold simply because he fell down. Presidents trip all the time. It took hold because it confirmed a subconscious fear in the electorate that the country was out of control, that the man at the wheel was incompetent, that we were all just sliding on a wet surface waiting to crash. Every time Ford stumbled, America flinched. His physical body became a metaphor for the body politic, unstable, uncoordinated, and prone to humiliating accidents. Yet behind the closed doors of the executive mansion, a different man was emerging. A man who looked at the maps of the Soviet Union and understood the existential threat of nuclear winter. A man who looked at the inflation numbers and refused to panic, even as his advisors screamed for radical measures. There was a stoicism to Ford that went unappreciated. He was absorbing the shocks of the system. He was the shock absorber of democracy. He took the hits so the chassis wouldn't break. It was a thankless, grinding role. He was the janitor of the American century, called in to clean up the mess after the wildest party in history, knowing full well that no one thanks the janitor. They just complain that he missed a spot. As the autumn of 1974 approached, the shadows lengthened across the Rose Garden. The initial relief of Nixon's departure was fading, replaced by a gnawing hunger for retribution. The ghost of Richard Nixon was not content to stay in San Clemente. It hovered over Washington, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The legal machinery was grinding toward an indictment of the former president. The spectacle of a criminal trial for a man who had held the nuclear codes was becoming a terrifying probability. Ford watched this gathering storm with a growing sense of dread. He knew with the instinct of a man who had navigated treacherous waters before that the ship of state could not handle another typhoon. He looked at the horizon and saw the waves building. He knew he had to do something. He knew he had to make a move that would likely end his career but might, just might, save the ship. He sat alone in the study, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He thought about his father, the man who had abandoned him. He thought about the man who had adopted him. He thought about the $25 bill. He thought about the razor-thin margin between survival and destruction. And he realized that being a survivor wasn't just about staying alive. Sometimes being a survivor meant sacrificing yourself so that others could live. The accidental Caesar was preparing to fall on his sword, not out of shame, but out of a rigid, devastating sense of duty. The stage was set for the most controversial act of forgiveness in American history, an act that would turn the survivor into a pariah. The root of this desperate, almost pathological need for stability lies not in Washington, but in a stiflingly hot summer in Omaha, Nebraska in 1913. It begins with a birth certificate that does not bear the name Gerald Ford. History remembers him as the quintessential Midwesterner, boring, reliable, solid as a block of granite. But this identity was a construction, a fortress built to hide a terrifying secret. The man who would become the 38th president was born Leslie Lynch King, Jr. And he was born not into the American dream, but into a Gothic nightmare of domestic terror. His biological father, Leslie Lynch King Sr., was the son of a wealthy wool merchant. On paper, he was a catch, rich, handsome, charismatic. In reality, he was a monster. He was a man consumed by the twin demons of alcohol and a violent, possessive jealousy. He was the kind of man who viewed his wife Dorothy not as a partner, but as property. The marriage was a sham from the moment the ink dried on the license, a descent into physical and emotional abuse that reached its crescendo just 2 weeks after the future president was born. It is night. The air in the house is thick with the smell of stale whiskey and fear. Dorothy is in her bedroom, cradling her 14-day-old son, the infant Leslie. The door bursts open. Leslie King Sr. stands there, his eyes glazed with a murderous rage, fueled by some imagined slight, some paranoid delusion of infidelity. In his hand, he grips a large butcher knife. The metal glints in the low light. He does not scream. He seethes. He advances on the bed, raising the knife, threatening to slaughter both his wife and the crying infant in her arms. It is a primal scene of violence. The future leader of the free world, the man who would one day hold the nuclear codes, began his life staring down the blade of a knife held by his own father. The psychological imprint of this moment, even if not consciously remembered by the infant, cannot be overstated. It established the fundamental dynamic of Ford's existence. The world is a dangerous, chaotic place where the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones most likely to kill you. Survival depends on escape. Survival depends on finding a protector. Dorothy, possessing a courage that would later be reflected in her son, waited for King to pass out or leave. Then she bundled the baby up and fled into the night. She didn't look back. She filed for divorce, a mark of shame in 1913 society that required immense fortitude to bear, and took her son away from the madness of the King family. She erased the name. She erased the father. She set about the work of rewriting history. She moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and found the antidote to Leslie King. She found Gerald Rudolph Ford. If Leslie King was chaos, Gerald Ford Sr. was order. He was a paint salesman, a profession that practically screams mundane stability. He was a man of quiet integrity, a churchgoer, a man who believed in hard work and paying your bills on time. He married Dorothy and gave the boy his name. The terrified infant Leslie Lynch King Jr. was buried, and the wholesome all-American boy Gerald R. Ford Jr. was born. For years, this was the only truth the boy knew. He grew up in a house that was a fortress of normalcy. The Fords were not rich, but they were respectable. They were the kind of family that sat down to dinner together every night at 6 o'clock sharp. They were the kind of family where emotions were kept in check, where voices were never raised because everyone silently understood that raising your voice was the first step back toward the knife. Young Jerry Ford worshipped his stepfather. He adopted his mannerisms, his politics, his stoicism. He molded himself into the perfect son, the perfect reflection of this good, dull man. He was constructing a suit of armor made of decency. But the past is a ghost that cannot be exorcised simply by changing a name on a piece of paper. The detective element of Ford's life, the unveiling of secrets, arrived with brutal force when he was 17 years old. The year was 1930. The Great Depression had clamped its jaws around America. Grand Rapids was suffering. The Ford family, like everyone else, was scraping by. Jerry, now a high school football star and a model student, was working part-time at a greasy spoon diner called Bill's Place to earn his keep. He was flipping burgers and wiping tables, sweating for pennies, learning the value of $1 the hard way. One afternoon, the rhythm of the lunch rush was broken by the arrival of a car that had no business being in that neighborhood. It was a new Lincoln, shining, chrome-laden, a rolling palace of wealth. It pulled up to the curb with an arrogance that turned heads. A man stepped out. He was well-dressed, confident, smelling of expensive tobacco and entitlement. He walked into the diner and asked for Jerry Ford. The teenager wiped his hands on his apron and walked over confused. The man looked him up and down, a strange smile playing on his lips. "I'm Leslie King," he said. "I'm your father." The floor must have dropped out from under Jerry Ford. For 17 years, he had believed the paint salesman was his flesh and blood. Now, this stranger, this specter from a nightmare he had never been told about, was standing there in a bespoke suit while Ford stood in a stained apron. The interaction that followed was a masterclass in cruelty that would define Ford's moral compass forever. King didn't come to apologize. He didn't come to make amends for the knife or the abandonment. He had come seemingly on a whim. He took the boy out to the Lincoln. He talked about his business, his wealth, his life in Wyoming. He boasted. He preened. And then came the insult. As he prepared to leave, perhaps sensing the boy's poverty, or perhaps just wanting to buy his conscience clean, King reached into his wallet. He pulled out a crisp $25 bill. "Here," he said, pressing it into his son's hand, "buy yourself something." Then he got back in his Lincoln and drove away. He didn't look back. He wouldn't see his son again for decades. $25. In 1930, it was a significant sum, maybe 2 weeks of back-breaking labor for a teenager. But to Jerry Ford, it burned like a brand. It was a transaction. His father was paying him off. The man who had tried to kill him was now trying to buy him and doing it cheaply. Ford stood on the sidewalk, watching the dust settle behind the luxury car, clutching the money. He later admitted he cried tears of pure rage. In that moment, a hard resolve crystallized in the young man's mind. He looked at the retreating Lincoln, representing wealth without honor, and he looked at his own hands, calloused from work. He made a silent blood vow. He would never be like Leslie Lynch King. He would never be erratic. He would never be cruel. He would never abandon a responsibility. He would be the anti-king. He would be steady, loyal, and unimaginative if that's what it took to be good. He went home that night and told his stepfather everything. The two men sat in the kitchen, and for the first time, the paint salesman told the boy the truth about the knife. the flight, the terror. The bond between them hardened into something unbreakable. Jerry Ford realized that biology is an accident, but family is a choice. He chose the paint salesman. He chose stability. And he decided right then and there that he would spend the rest of his life protecting that stability no matter the cost. This trauma drove him into the physical realm. If he couldn't control the chaos of his origins, he would control his own body. He threw himself into football with a ferocity that bordered on religious zeal. At the University of Michigan, he wasn't just a player, he was a weapon. He played center, the position that anchors the line, the position that snaps the ball to start the play, the position that takes the first hit. It was perfect for him. He was the survivor in the trenches. He became the MVP of the Michigan Wolverines. He was a star. But unlike the modern image of the pampered athlete, Ford was a grinder. He played through pain. He played through bad weather. He developed a physical toughness that was legendary. On the field, he was in control. If you hit him, he hit back harder. If you tried to knock him down, he got up. He was exercising the ghost of Leslie King, one tackle at a time. When he graduated, the NFL came calling. The Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers both offered him contracts. It was the dream of every young American man. Glory, money, fame. He turned them down. Why? Because football was a game, and Jerry Ford was done with games. He wanted the law. He wanted the structure of rules that governed society. He wanted to understand the machinery that kept chaos at bay. He applied to Yale Law School, but here, his ingrained humility almost derailed him. Yale was for the elite, the sons of senators and bankers. Ford was the son of a paint salesman and a bankrupt wool merchant. He had no money. He had to fight his way in. He took a job as a boxing coach and assistant football coach at Yale just to get his foot in the door. He worked full-time during the day and studied the law at night, rubbing elbows with the American aristocracy while wearing a coach's whistle. This period at Yale, 1935 to 1941, was the crucible that forged his intellect. But it was a specific kind of intellect. He wasn't a philosopher king like Jefferson or a visionary like Lincoln. He was a mechanic of the law. He viewed the Constitution not as a poetic document, but as an operating manual. If you followed the rules, the machine worked. If you broke the rules, like his biological father did, the machine exploded. He was surrounded by brilliant, flashy minds at Yale, men who could argue circles around him. But Ford had something they didn't: endurance. He could outwork them. While they were at cocktail parties, he was in the library. While they were debating abstract theories of justice, he was grading papers to pay his rent. He was building a resentment against the fancy talkers, the people who used words to obscure the truth. He preferred facts. He preferred things you could touch. It was during these years that the dichotomy of his character was locked in. To the world, he was the golden boy, handsome, athletic, friendly, the kind of guy you wanted to have a beer with. He was good old Jerry. But inside, there was a watchfulness, a tension. He was always scanning the horizon for the Lincoln car, for the butcher knife. He was always preparing for the moment when the stability would shatter. And shatter it did. Just as he was establishing his legal practice back in Grand Rapids, just as he was settling into the quiet life he craved, the radio crackled with news from a place called Pearl Harbor. The world had gone mad again. The survivor was about to be tested not by a bad father, but by the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. Ford didn't wait to be drafted. The instinct that made him stand up to the memory of his father made him stand up for his country. He closed his law books, hung up his football cleats, and signed his name on the Navy enlistment papers. But this time, he wasn't running away from a knife. He was running toward the fire. He was 28 years old. He was in the prime of his life, and he was about to learn that the ocean cares even less about your plans than a drunk father does. The Klutz narrative was about to be born, but in the most terrifying way imaginable. He was trading the courtroom for the deck of an aircraft carrier, a floating city of steel and gasoline where one wrong step meant death. The transformation was complete. Leslie Lynch King Jr. was dead and buried. Gerald Ford, the lawyer, was on pause. Lieutenant Gerald Ford, the warrior, was stepping onto the stage. He believed he was fighting for democracy, but deep down, he was fighting for the only thing that ever really mattered to him, the right to live a life without fear. The tragedy, of course, was that fear would follow him halfway across the world, riding on the winds of a typhoon that would make the butcher knife look like a toy. The Pacific Ocean is not a place. It is a mood. It is a vast, indifferent blue void that swallows history without leaving a ripple. In 1942, Gerald Ford traded the mahogany-paneled predictability of a Grand Rapids law office for this terrifying emptiness. He was 29 years old, a man in the absolute physical prime of his life, possessing the kind of jaw-clenched American optimism that believed the world could be fixed with enough hard work and fair play. He was about to learn that the ocean does not care about fairness, and it certainly does not care about the law. The transformation was absolute. One day, he was Attorney Ford, dealing with property disputes and contracts. The next, he was Lieutenant Ford, a number on a dog tag, standing on the heaving deck of the USS Monterey, CVL-26. The Monterey was a light aircraft carrier, a frantic floating city of steel, gasoline, and 1,500 souls, carved out of a cruiser hull to feed the insatiable hunger of the war machine. It was cramped. It smelled perpetually of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and high-octane aviation gas, and it was a prime target for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Ford wasn't just a passenger. He was a key operator in this mechanical beast. He served as the assistant navigator, the athletic director, responsible for keeping the crew physically fighting fit, and, most critically, the general quarters officer of the deck. This meant that when the sirens wailed, when the kamikazes were diving, or the torpedo wakes were spotted, Jerry Ford was the man on the bridge, the eyes and ears of the captain, responsible for orchestrating the ship's survival. This period of his life is often glossed over in biographies as a standard service to country chapter. But the USS Monterey was no standard assignment. It was a floating crucible. Ford participated in nearly every major naval action in the Pacific from late 1943 to 1944. He was there for the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, the strikes on Cavien, the landings at Kwajalein, and Eniwetok. He saw the sky turn black with flak during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. He watched planes flown by boys he had eaten breakfast with take off from the deck and never return, disappearing into the blue indifference. He learned to compartmentalize terror. He learned that leadership wasn't about making speeches. It was about standing still when everyone else wanted to run. He developed a philosophical stance toward death. It was random, it was messy, and it was always close. But the enemy that nearly killed Gerald Ford wasn't Japanese. It wasn't a Zero fighter or a submarine. It was the wind. December 1944. The Third Fleet, under the command of the legendary but reckless Admiral William Bull Halsey, was operating in the Philippine Sea. They were hunting the enemy, but they were being hunted by something far older and more powerful. A tropical cyclone of biblical proportions was brewing in the dark waters to the east. It was Typhoon Cobra. The fleet's meteorologists missed it. They underestimated the speed and ferocity of the system. On December 18th, the trap snapped shut. The Monterey, along with dozens of other ships, sailed directly into the maw of the monster. The morning of December 18th was the stuff of nightmares. The sky didn't just turn dark, it turned a bruised, sickly purple. The barometer didn't fall, it crashed. The wind speed climbed past 100 knots, 115 miles per hour, screaming with a sound that sailors described as 1,000 freight trains derailing at once. The waves were not waves, they were moving mountains of water 70 feet high, blotting out the horizon, crashing down on the steel decks with the weight of collapsing buildings. The Monterey was a light carrier. It was top-heavy with planes, radar masts, and guns. In these seas, it was a toy boat in a washing machine. The ship began to roll, violent, sickening lurches of 20, 30, then 40 degrees. Men were thrown from their bunks. Bones were broken against bulkheads. Then came the fire. At the height of the storm, the planes secured in the hangar deck broke loose from their chains. They slid across the steel deck like crashing billiard balls. Their fuselages smashed together, rupturing fuel tanks. A spark ignited the spilled high-octane gasoline. In seconds, the belly of the ship was a raging inferno. The Monterey was now burning from the inside while being drowned from the outside. General quarters sounded. Ford, acting on instinct and training, scrambled from his bunk. His station was the bridge. He had to get there. He climbed the ladders, fighting the violent motion of the ship. He emerged onto the flight deck to assess the situation. The scene that greeted him was apocalyptic. The wind was so strong it distorted his face. The rain was horizontal, stinging like buckshot. Smoke was pouring from the ventilators. The ship pitched violently into a trough, burying its bow in a mountain of green water. Then the Monterey rolled, a massive shuddering roll to the starboard side. Ford was standing on the flight deck. The steel was slick with oil, rain, and foam. As the ship tilted, gravity took hold. Ford lost his footing. Time slowed down, a phenomenon reported by survivors of near-death experiences. Ford was sliding. He was on his back, hurtling across the width of the flight deck. He was picking up speed. Below him, he could see the angry, churning black water of the Pacific waiting to swallow him. There was no railing where he was sliding, only the catwalk and the drop. He was sliding toward his death. He was the president-to-be, the future of the Republican Party, the father of children not yet born, and he was about to be erased by a wet deck and a gust of wind. The irony chills the blood. The man who would later be lampooned by the entire world as the klutz for tripping on a carpet was currently navigating the most treacherous surface on Earth. He wasn't clumsy. He was in a fight with physics. As he reached the edge of the deck, as his legs went over the side, his body twisted. He was going over. But at the last possible fraction of a second, the heel of his boot, his standard issue Navy boot, caught on a 2-inch steel coaming, a raised lip around the deck edge gutter. 2 inches of steel. That was the margin. The catch was violent. It wrenched his ankle, but it stopped his slide just enough. He grabbed for the edge, his fingers digging into the metal. He hung there for a heartbeat, suspended over the abyss, the wind tearing at his uniform, the ocean roaring below. Then, summoning the strength of the all-American linebacker he once was, he hauled himself back onto the deck. He didn't stop to breathe. He didn't stop to pray. The ship was burning. He scrambled to the bridge. For the next several hours, Ford was instrumental in saving the ship. The admiral on board, terrified by the fire, ordered the captain to abandon ship. It was a death sentence in that storm. The lifeboats would have been crushed instantly. Ford and the captain, displaying a mutinous kind of courage, ignored the order. Ford led a team down into the burning hangar deck. They fought the fire in a suffocating hell of smoke and heat, While the ship continued to roll 40 degrees, they pushed burning planes over the side into the ocean. They secured the loose bombs. They saved the Monterey. When the sun rose the next morning, the Pacific was calm, mocking the violence of the night before. But the toll was horrific. 3 destroyers, the USS Spence, USS Hull, and USS Monaghan, had capsized and sunk with all hands. Nearly 800 American sailors were dead. They hadn't died fighting fascism. They had died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ford stood on the scorched deck of the Monterey, looking out at the empty ocean where the destroyers used to be. The philosophy of the survivor took root deep in his soul. Why him? Why did his heel catch the 2-inch strip of metal? Why did the Monterey stay afloat while the Spence turned turtle? There was no logic to it. There was no meritocracy in survival. It was pure, terrifying chance. This event rewired Gerald Ford. It stripped away any lingering arrogance. He realized that control is an illusion. You can be the best sailor, the strongest athlete, the smartest lawyer, and the wind can still blow you off the map. The only thing you can do, the only thing is stand your watch, do your duty, and hold on tight. It reinforced his fatalism. It made him wary of grand schemes and visionary leaders who thought they could command the tides. He became a man of the status quo, a man who just wanted to keep the ship afloat. He returned to the United States in 1946, a lieutenant commander with stars on his campaign ribbon, but carrying the invisible weight of the 800 ghosts of Typhoon Cobra. He was 33 years old. He needed an anchor. He needed something to hold on to that wouldn't slide away. He found it in Elizabeth Betty Bloomer Warren. If Ford was the stoic survivor, Betty was the vibrant spark. A former dancer with the Martha Graham Company, a fashion coordinator, a divorcee, she was modern, sharp-witted, and carried her own scars. They met in Grand Rapids in 1947. Their courtship was brisk, driven by a mutual need for partnership. But even their wedding was dictated by Ford's new mistress, politics. Ford had decided to run for Congress. His advisors told him that marrying a divorced ex-dancer might scandalize the conservative voters of West Michigan. So, in a calculated move that foreshadowed the secrecy of his political life, he delayed the wedding until just weeks before the election. He married Betty on October 15, 1948, in the middle of his campaign. He literally showed up to the wedding with mud on his shoes from a campaign event. This was the fatal flaw manifesting in his personal life, the subordination of the personal to the political, the willingness to edit his own life to fit the expectations of the public. Betty didn't just marry Jerry, she married his ambition. She married the public image he was constructing. They seemed like the golden couple. He, the war hero and rising political star. She, the beautiful, supportive wife. But beneath the glossy photos of their growing family, Michael, Jack, Steve, and Susan, the fault lines were already there. Ford was gone constantly. He was traveling, campaigning, shaking hands, building the network that would take him to Washington. He was running away from the chaos of his childhood and the terror of the typhoon by burying himself in work. Betty was left alone in the suburbs, raising 4 children, managing the household, playing the role of the perfect political wife. The isolation was crushing. To cope with the physical pain of a pinched nerve and the emotional pain of loneliness, she began to rely on prescription painkillers, then alcohol. It was a slow, quiet slide, much like Ford's slide on the deck, but there was no 2-inch combing to catch her, not yet. Ford, the man who could spot a flaw in a budget report from a mile away, was blind to the pain in his own living room, or perhaps he chose not to see it. He was too busy being the survivor in the political jungle to notice that his own home was taking on water. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, Ford settled into his seat in the House of Representatives. He was safe, he was respected, he was far away from the ocean. He thought the storms were behind him. He didn't realize that the biggest typhoon of his life, a political storm named Watergate, was waiting 20 years in the future, and this time he wouldn't be able to just hold on. He would have to steer the ship directly into the waves. The war had made him a man who feared nothing but disorder. Returning home, he married Betty Bloomer, a vibrant former dancer, and launched a political career that was essentially a quest for that order. He spent the next quarter century climbing the ladder rung by rung, never looking down, unaware that the ladder was leaning against a burning building. Washington, D.C. in the 1950s was a small town with a global footprint. It was a city of limestone and secrets, where power was traded over bourbon and branch water in smoke-filled committee rooms. Into this arena stepped Gerald R. Ford, the newly minted congressman from Michigan's 5th District. He arrived in January 1949 carrying his football shoulders and his lawyer's briefcase, determined to be the very thing he had promised himself he would be: useful, reliable, and entirely predictable. For the next decade and a half, Ford became part of the furniture of the House of Representatives. To the casual observer, he was the quintessential backbencher, a man who showed up early, stayed late, read the fine print in the budget appropriations, and never sought the spotlight. He was not a show horse, he was a workhorse. While other politicians, like the charismatic young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, were charming the press and gracing magazine covers, Ford was in the basement of the Capitol, memorizing defense spending charts. But beneath the good old Jerry exterior, the survivor instinct was evolving into something sharper. Ford was not just surviving, he was climbing. He understood that in the House, power didn't come from speeches. It came from relationships. He built a network of loyalty that was staggering in its breadth. He wrote thank you notes by the thousands. He remembered birthdays. He campaigned for colleagues in tight races. He was depositing political capital into a bank account that he intended to cash in later. This period reveals a hidden layer of Ford's character, his capacity for calculated ruthlessness. The narrative of Ford as a naive man collapses when you examine the events of 1963 and 1965. The Republican Party in the House was being led by Charles Halleck, an old-school gruff conservative who seemed content to let the Democrats run the show, as long as he got his perks. A group of younger, restless Republicans, self-styled the Young Turks, wanted a change. They wanted a leader who could present a fresh face to the public. They looked at Ford. Ford didn't hesitate. The man who valued loyalty above all else orchestrated a coup against his own leader. It was a polite, Midwestern assassination. He challenged Halleck for the position of minority leader. He worked the phones. He called in his favors. When the votes were counted, Halleck was out and Ford was in. He had decapitated the party leadership with a smile. It was a lesson in the fatal flaw of Washington. The nicest guy in the room is often the one holding the knife. But the event that would define this era of his life and haunt his legacy forever was not a political maneuver. It was a national tragedy. November 22, 1963. The shots rang out in Dallas. The world stopped. Gerald Ford was in the House chamber when the news broke. He was devastated. It is crucial to remember that Ford and Kennedy were not just political rivals. They were friends. They had entered Congress together in the class of '46. They had offices next to each other. They played golf together. They represented the two faces of the same generation, the glamorous, wealthy Kennedy and the solid, self-made Ford. When Kennedy died, Ford wept. But grief in Washington is short-lived. It is quickly replaced by procedure. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, needed to quell the rising panic. Rumors were flying. Was it the Soviets, the Cubans, the CIA? Johnson knew that if the public believed there was a conspiracy, it could lead to World War III or a domestic revolution. He needed an investigation that would reach a conclusion of stability. He needed a commission that would produce a report the public would trust. He created the Warren Commission, and he handpicked Gerald Ford to serve on it. Why Ford? Johnson was a master of psychology. He knew the commission needed bipartisan credibility. He couldn't pick a firebrand. He needed a Republican who was viewed as honest, unimaginative, and incapable of lying. He needed good old Jerry. Ford was chosen precisely because his dullness was a proxy for truthfulness. Ford accepted the duty. For 10 months, he sat in the closed rooms of the commission, sifting through the grisly debris of the assassination. He looked at the autopsy photos. He handled the rifle. He listened to the testimony. And this is where the investigation takes a dark turn into the manipulation of truth. The commission was facing a geometric nightmare. It was called the single bullet theory. For Lee Harvey Oswald to be the lone gunman, one specific bullet, Exhibit 399, had to account for multiple wounds. It had to strike Kennedy in the back, exit his throat, enter Governor Connolly's back, exit his chest, smash his wrist, and end up in his thigh. The problem was the anatomy. The initial FBI report and the preliminary autopsy notes placed the entrance wound in Kennedy's back too low. If the bullet entered where the agents said it did, below the shoulder blade, it would have had to travel upward to exit his throat. But the shooter was 6 floors above him. The physics were impossible. The geometry of death didn't add up. If the bullet didn't exit the throat, then the throat wound was an entrance wound, which meant there was a second shooter from the front, the grassy knoll. If there was a second shooter, there was a conspiracy. If there was a conspiracy, the report was a failure, and the country would plunge into chaos. The commission was stuck. The evidence was refusing to cooperate with the conclusion they needed. Then Gerald Ford picked up his pen. We know this because the draft manuscripts of the Warren Report were preserved. In the original draft, the description of the wound read, "A bullet had entered his back at a point slightly above the shoulder and to the right of the spine." Ford looked at this sentence. It was scientifically problematic. It didn't support the single bullet theory. With his own hand, Ford crossed out the word back. He edited the sentence to read, "A bullet had entered the base of the back of his neck." It was a change of mere inches. But in the forensic world, inches are miles. By moving the entrance wound up from the back to the neck, Ford created a downward trajectory that aligned perfectly with the exit wound in the throat and the wounds in Governor Connolly. He made the magic bullet possible. He made the physics work. Ford later defended this vehemently until his dying day. He claimed he wasn't altering the facts. He was clarifying the language. He argued that the autopsy doctors had described the wound as being in the upper thoracic region, which could be interpreted as the neck. He insisted he was just making the report more precise for the layperson. The tragedy is profound. Ford, the man who built his entire life on the foundation of honesty, the man who hated his father for the lie of the $25 bill, was now the architect of the ultimate fudge. Why did he do it? He didn't do it to protect Lee Harvey Oswald. He didn't do it because he was part of a sinister cabal. He did it because of his overriding philosophy, stability above all else. Ford looked at the fragile state of the nation. He saw a country terrified of nuclear war. He believed with every fiber of his being that the American people could not handle the ambiguity of a conspiracy. They needed closure. They needed a lone gunman. They needed the monsters to be small and manageable, not systemic and vast. So he moved the bullet. He edited history to save the future. This act was a critical error writ large. It was a well-intentioned deception that planted the seeds of the very destruction he was trying to prevent. When the public eventually saw the Zapruder film, when they saw the autopsy diagrams, when they realized the discrepancy that Ford had tried to smooth over, their trust in the government didn't just crack, it shattered. The credibility gap that would swallow the 1960s and 70s began, in part, with the tip of Gerald Ford's pen. He thought he was building a bridge over the trauma. In reality, he was building a wall between the government and the truth. The irony is sickening. Ford was the survivor of the typhoon. He knew that nature was chaotic, but when faced with the chaos of human violence, he couldn't accept it. He tried to force the messy, bloody reality of the assassination into a neat, logical box. He tried to impose order on a chaotic universe. Ford emerged from the Warren Commission in 1964 with his reputation enhanced. He was seen as a statesman. He had served his country in its darkest hour. He had looked into the abyss and reported back that there were no monsters there, just one crazy man with a gun. But the ghosts of Dallas followed him. The decision to prioritize political stability over absolute forensic transparency would become the template for his presidency. 10 years later, when faced with the crimes of Richard Nixon, Ford would revert to the exact same instinct: move the bullet, smooth the edge, close the book, do not let the people see the chaos. The pardon of Nixon was not an aberration, it was the sequel to the Warren Commission. It was the same man using the same logic, trying to save the country from the truth. As the 1960s spiraled into the violence of Vietnam and the race riots, Ford stood as the minority leader, a bastion of old-school republicanism. He watched the country burn. He watched the protests. He watched the moral certainty of the World War II generation evaporate. He didn't understand the counterculture. He didn't understand the rage. To him, the system worked because the system had allowed a boy named Leslie King to become Gerald Ford. He defended the Vietnam War long after others had turned against it. He defended the institutions. He became the face of the establishment. At the exact moment the word became a slur. But fate wasn't done with him. The accidental Caesar was about to be called up from the minor leagues. In 1973, the rot in the White House began to smell too strong to ignore. Vice President Spiro Agnew, a man Ford had loyally supported, was revealed to be a petty crook. The line of succession was broken. When Nixon called Ford to offer him the vice presidency, Ford asked Betty. She was hesitant. Her health was failing. The pills and the drink were taking their toll. She wanted him to retire. They had a plan. He would serve one more term in the House. Then they would move to a condo in Palm Springs and play golf. But Ford couldn't say no to duty. He told her, "It's just for a few years, Betty. It's the vice presidency. It's a ceremonial job. I'll just be presiding over the Senate. It will be easier." It was the greatest miscalculation of his life. He wasn't stepping into a ceremonial retirement. He was stepping onto the deck of the Monterey in the middle of a typhoon, and this time the ship was already on fire. The man who had moved the bullet was about to become the target. The year 1973 was the year the American government began to rot from the head down. While the public was transfixed by the slow-motion car crash of the Watergate hearings, a second, more squalid tumor was metastasizing in the office of the vice president. Spiro Agnew, the attack dog of the Nixon administration, the man who railed against nattering nabobs of negativism and preached law and order with a curled lip, was revealed to be a petty criminal. It wasn't high crimes and misdemeanors. It was grocery store corruption. Agnew had been taking envelopes stuffed with cash, literal bribes from construction contractors, across his desk in the White House basement. He was a cheap crook in a tailored suit. On October 10, 1973, facing imminent indictment, Agnew resigned in disgrace. For the first time in American history, the office of the vice president was vacant. The 25th Amendment, ratified only 6 years earlier in the wake of Kennedy's death, provided the mechanism for filling the void. The president would nominate a replacement, who had to be confirmed by both houses of Congress. Richard Nixon, cornered like a rat in the Oval Office, looked at the chessboard. He needed a pawn. He needed someone so bland, so unthreatening, and so thoroughly liked by Congress that his confirmation would be a rubber stamp. But Nixon's calculation was darker than that. He operated on a theory of impeachment insurance. Nixon believed that the Democrats in Congress hated him, but they viewed Gerald Ford as an intellectual lightweight. In Nixon's twisted logic, if he appointed Ford, good old Jerry, the plotter, the helmetless football player, Congress would never dare impeach Nixon, because the alternative would be a President Ford. Nixon thought he was appointing a scarecrow to guard the cornfield. He was wrong. He was appointing his own undertaker. When Ford received the call, he was stunned. He had no desire for the executive branch. He was a creature of the legislature, but the philosophy of duty, drilled into him since the days he faced down his biological father, kicked in. The country was leaderless. The line of succession was severed. If Nixon died or was removed, the Speaker of the House, a Democrat, Carl Albert, would take over, overturning the 1972 election results and sparking a constitutional crisis. Ford accepted the nomination not for Nixon, but to keep the machine from breaking. The confirmation hearings were a surreal piece of dramatic irony. Ford was investigated by the FBI more thoroughly than any man in history. Hundreds of agents scoured his life. They looked for dirt. They looked for women. They looked for money. They found nothing. They found a man who paid his bills, a man who had $1,200 in a checking account, a man whose biggest financial sin was being frugal. The contrast with the rotting stench of the Nixon White House was blinding. Ford was confirmed by the Senate 93-3 and by the House 387-35. On December 6, 1973, Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 40th vice president. He made a joke playing into his own reputation. "I am a Ford, not a Lincoln." The room laughed, but the laughter was nervous. Everyone in that room knew they weren't just swearing in a vice president. They were swearing in the backup pilot for a plane that was already in a nosedive. For 8 months, Vice President Ford lived in a purgatory of loyalty. He traveled the country defending Nixon. He gave speeches declaring Nixon's innocence. He was the good soldier marching into the fire. Was he naive or was he in denial? The truth was more pragmatic. He was compartmentalizing. He knew Nixon was likely guilty, but until the evidence was absolute, his job was to maintain the stability of the institution. He was the first mate, refusing to admit the captain was drunk until the ship actually hit the iceberg. The iceberg arrived in the summer of 1974. The Supreme Court ordered Nixon to release the smoking gun tape. The tape proved Nixon had ordered the CIA to block the FBI investigation into the Watergate break-in just days after it happened. It was obstruction of justice. It was a felony. Nixon's support evaporated. The impeachment insurance policy had expired. The Republican leadership, including Ford's old friends, marched to the White House and told Nixon the truth. "Mr. President, you don't have the votes. You have to go." August 9th, 1974. The scene in the East Room was a funeral for the living. Nixon gave a rambling, tearful farewell speech. He talked about his mother. He talked about failure. It was a glimpse into a tortured soul. Ford stood to the side, his face a mask of stoic grief. He wasn't grieving for Nixon, he was grieving for the office. As Nixon's helicopter, Army One, lifted off the South Lawn, the silence that followed was deafening. In that instant, the nuclear codes, the command of the armed forces, the weight of the entire free world transferred invisibly to Gerald Ford. He walked to the podium. He had not campaigned. He had no platform. He had no mandate. He looked into the camera lenses and uttered the words that would define his legacy. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. It was a masterstroke of simplicity. It was the survivor speaking. We survived the storm. The ship is still afloat. But the nightmare wasn't over. It had just changed shape. For the first 30 days, Ford was the most popular man in America. He was the anti-Nixon. He opened the windows. He invited the press in. He toasted his own English muffins. The country, desperate for a father figure who wasn't abusive, projected all their hopes onto him. But in the dark corners of the West Wing, a new crisis was brewing. Nixon was gone, but he wasn't gone. He was in San Clemente, California, a brooding exile. But legally, he was just a private citizen, and the special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, was preparing to indict him. The prospect of a criminal trial of a former president was a visceral horror to Ford. He imagined the scene. Richard Nixon, the man who had opened China, sitting in a defendant's dock for months, perhaps years. The jury selection alone would take a year. The testimony would dominate the news every single day. The country would be dragged back into the mud of Watergate, reliving every tape, every crime, every dirty trick. The economy was collapsing. Inflation was at 11%. Unemployment was rising. The Cold War was freezing over. And yet Ford knew that as long as the Nixon question remained unanswered, he could not govern. He could not talk about the budget or foreign policy without a reporter asking, "Mr. President, are you going to send Nixon to jail?" Ford was trapped. If he let the trial proceed, the country would be paralyzed by the spectacle. If he stopped it, he would be accused of corruption. He began to meet secretly with his legal counsel. He sent an envoy, Benton Becker, to negotiate with Nixon. The stakes could not have been higher. Ford wanted something in return. He wanted an admission of guilt, but Nixon was Nixon. He refused to admit he committed a crime. He would only admit to mistakes. Ford had to make a choice. It was a choice between justice and mercy, between retribution and stability. He went back to the philosophy that had guided him on the Warren Commission. The country cannot handle the chaos. Just as he had moved the bullet to close the JFK case, he decided he had to move the law to close the Nixon case. He decided to grant a full, free, and absolute pardon. He knew it would destroy him. He told his wife, Betty, "I'm going to catch hell for this." He didn't know the half of it. Sunday morning, September 8th, 1974. The timing was deliberate. Sunday, the day of forgiveness. Ford went on live television. There was no fanfare. He sat at his desk reading from a piece of paper, his hands trembling slightly, the shaky hand of history. He spoke about how the Nixon family had suffered enough. He spoke about how a trial would be a tragedy in which we all have played a part. He spoke about the need to shut the book. Then he signed the proclamation. The reaction was instantaneous and nuclear. It was an explosion of rage. The switchboard at the White House lit up with so many calls it nearly melted the circuits. Telegrams poured in by the thousands, describing the act as treason, a deal, a cover-up. Jairus Leonard, a former Justice Department official, famously said, "Ford has just committed suicide." The press, who had been treating Ford like a refreshing breeze, turned on him with the ferocity of wolves. They felt betrayed. They had just gotten rid of a crook, and now the new guy was letting the crook walk free? The narrative shifted instantly. Ford wasn't the honest Jerry. He was a stooge. He was part of the swamp. Ford's failure was his inability to understand the emotional needs of the victim, the American public. The public didn't want stability yet. They wanted catharsis. They wanted to see the bad man punished. By denying them that punishment, Ford denied them their closure. He treated the nation like a logical problem to be solved, not an emotional wound to be tended. His approval ratings crashed from 71% to 50% in a single week, the steepest drop in presidential history. He was booed in public. His own press secretary, Gerald Ford, a friend of 30 years, resigned in protest, unable to defend the indefensible. Ford stood alone in the Oval Office, the silence now replaced by the roar of a furious nation. He had saved Nixon. He had arguably saved the dignity of the presidency. But in doing so, he had sacrificed his own political legitimacy. He had thrown himself on the grenade. And the irony? The detective element reveals that Ford was right. Years later, historians would agree that a Nixon trial would have been a grotesque circus that would have crippled the government for years. Ford took the bullet so the country didn't have to. But in 1974, nobody cared about history. They only cared about the betrayal. The accidental Caesar was now the cursed king. He had stripped himself of the only armor he had, his reputation for integrity. He was now vulnerable, and the wolves were gathering. But the wolves weren't just in the press room. They were out in the world, watching, waiting. The instability that Ford tried to banish with a signature was about to manifest in a much more literal, violent form. The pardon had unleashed a toxic energy in the country. The radicals, the crazies, the people on the fringe who felt the system was rigged, they were watching. They saw a man who protected criminals. They saw a target. In California, a young woman with dead eyes and a red robe was loading a .45 caliber pistol. She didn't care about the Constitution. She didn't care about the budget. She just wanted to make a statement. Gerald Ford had survived the typhoon. He had survived the political suicide of the pardon. But now he was about to face the one thing he couldn't negotiate with, the randomness of a bullet. By the late summer of 1975, the American presidency had begun to resemble a grim, surreal piece of performance art, a theater of the absurd where the line between tragedy and comedy had been irrevocably blurred. The dignity of the office, already battered by the paranoid machinations of Richard Nixon, was now being eroded by a new and unexpected acid, ridicule. Gerald Ford, the man who had played center for an undefeated national championship football team, the man who had fought fires on a burning aircraft carrier in the middle of a typhoon, was being transformed by the alchemy of the media into a national punchline. The catalyst for this transformation was a rain-slicked staircase in Salzburg, Austria. On June 1st, 1975, while descending from Air Force One, Ford's knee, an old football injury that flared up in the damp European weather, buckled under his weight. He slid down the last few steps, ending up in a heap on the wet tarmac. He stood up immediately, brushed himself off, and smiled. It was a minor incident, the kind of stumble that happens to millions of men every day. But the cameras were rolling. That single clip was played on loop on the nightly news. It became the visual shorthand for his entire administration, a stumbling president presiding over a stumbling economy. On Saturday Night Live, a young comedian named Chevy Chase began a weekly ritual of throwing himself over podiums, tripping on carpets, and smashing into walls, all while impersonating the commander-in-chief. The audience roared. They laughed because it felt safe to laugh. If the president was just a goofy, uncoordinated dad, then maybe he wasn't dangerous. Maybe he was just a klutz. But this tragic comedy obscured a terrifying truth. While America was laughing at the klutz, the dark, chaotic forces of the 1970s were sharpening their knives. The ridicule stripped Ford of his aura of invincibility. If he was a clown, he was a vulnerable clown. And in the fever swamps of the American radical fringe, predators were watching. The laughter of the television audience masked the sound of gun slides being racked and hammers being cocked. September 1975 would go down as one of the strangest, most violent, and most psychologically dense months in the history of the Secret Service. It was the season of the assassin. And in a bizarre twist of dramatic irony, the threat didn't come from the Soviet Union or a well-trained sniper. It came from the shattered remnants of the 1960s counterculture, lost souls who had drifted from peace and love into madness and murder. On the morning of September 5th, 1975, Gerald Ford woke up in Sacramento, California. The sun was shining with that deceptive Californian brightness that makes everything look optimistic, hiding the rot beneath the surface. He was scheduled to walk from his hotel, the Senator Hotel, to the state capitol for a meeting with Governor Jerry Brown. The Secret Service was on edge. California was the epicenter of the bizarre. It was the home of the Symbionese Liberation Army, the Manson family, the Zodiac Killer. The air felt charged with static, a psychic electricity that usually precedes a storm. Ford, true to his philosophy of being an open president, refused to hide. He wanted to walk. He wanted to shake hands. He wanted to show that he wasn't afraid of the people. He stepped out into the morning light, surrounded by a phalanx of agents, but the crowd was close, touchably, dangerously close. Standing in that crowd, under the dappled shade of an elm tree, was a petite woman with red hair and dead shark-like eyes. She was wearing a flowing red robe that made her look like a medieval penitent or a cult priestess. Her name was Lynette Squeaky Fromm. Fromm wasn't just a drifter, she was a disciple. She was one of the most devoted followers of Charles Manson, the man who had orchestrated the Tate LaBianca murders in 1969 in a failed attempt to start a race war. Manson was rotting in prison, but his poisonous ideology was still circulating in the veins of his family. Fromm believed that by killing the president, she could bring attention to Manson's environmental theories and perhaps testify on his behalf. It was a logic so fractured it defied analysis, but her intent was crystal clear. Strapped to her leg, hidden under the folds of the red robe, was a colossal weapon, a Colt M 1911.45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. It was a heavy military-grade hand cannon, a weapon designed for the trenches of World War I, capable of stopping a charging man in his tracks. As Ford moved through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling that broad Midwestern smile, Fromm saw her opening. She was barely 2 feet away from him. The distance was intimate. She could see the pores on his skin. She reached into her robe and drew the weapon. Ford saw it. He looked down and saw a hand extending from the sea of bodies, holding a gun aimed directly at his stomach. The distance was point blank. A shot from a .45 at that range would not just wound, it would eviscerate. The kinetic energy alone would have thrown him backward onto the pavement. Time stopped. In this moment, the instinct to survive clashed with the vulnerabilities of open democracy. Ford froze. The crowd froze. Fromm pulled the trigger. The hammer fell. Click. A sickening metallic sound echoed in the space between them. The gun didn't fire. The explosion didn't happen. The Secret Service agents, led by Larry Buendorf, reacted instantly, tackling Fromm and wresting the gun from her hand. Ford was hustled away, his face pale but composed, his eyes wide with the shock of a man who has just heard the sound of his own death and realized it was a false alarm. Why didn't the gun fire? It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't divine intervention. It was incompetence. The M1911 is a complex weapon. To fire it, you must insert a loaded magazine and then physically pull the slide back to chamber the first round. Fromm, in her drug-addled haste, or perhaps due to a lack of mechanical knowledge, had shoved the magazine in, which was full of bullets, but had forgotten to rack the slide. The chamber was empty. The mechanism worked perfectly. The operator had failed. Fate had intervened in the form of technical ignorance. The Klutz narrative was inverted. The assassin was the clumsy one. The survivor had walked away because his killer forgot how to use her tool. Ford, incredibly, continued his day. He met with the governor. He gave a speech. He refused to let the terror disrupt the schedule. "We cannot let the thugs rule the government," he said. It was a display of physical courage that the Saturday Night Live writers ignored, a stoicism that went uncelebrated. But the incident planted a seed of dread in the national consciousness. The president was a target. The taboo had been broken. And in the dark corners of the American psyche, the copycat effect began to take hold. For the next 2 weeks, the country held its breath. The image of Squeaky Fromm in her red robe dominated the airwaves. The idea that a president could be killed by a random woman in a crowd became a terrifying reality. Ford returned to Washington, but the schedule dictated that he return to California just 17 days later. This time, he was headed to San Francisco. The Secret Service pleaded with him. They begged him to wear a bulletproof vest. He agreed, though he hated the bulk of it under his suit, the way it restricted his movement and made him sweat. They begged him to avoid crowds, to move from the limousine to the door without stopping. He refused. "A president has to be seen," he insisted. He would not be a prisoner in his own country. On September 22, 1975, Ford finished a speaking engagement at the St. Francis Hotel on Union Square. A crowd of 3,000 people had gathered across the street. The mood was festive, but underneath the tension was palpable. Every agent was scanning the hands of the people in the front row. Ford exited the hotel's side door, waving. He moved toward his limousine, a bubble of officialdom moving through the chaotic streets of the city. In the crowd, standing across the street about 40 feet away, was a woman named Sarah Jane Moore. Moore was a study in contrast to Fromm. She was older, 45, a housewife turned FBI informant turned radical. She was mentally unstable, oscillating between trying to help the police and trying to impress the violent leftist underground. She had been evaluated by the Secret Service just the day before, interviewed, and deemed not dangerous enough to detain. It was a catastrophic bureaucratic failure, a blind spot in the system. Moore was armed with a .38 caliber revolver. Unlike Fromm's complex automatic, a revolver is simple: point and pull. There is no slide to rack. There is no safety to forget. It is a point and click interface for murder. As Ford waved, Moore raised the gun. She leveled it at the president's chest. The sight picture was clear. She fired. Crack! The sound echoed off the buildings of Union Square like a whip crack, sharper and louder than a car backfire. A puff of gray smoke drifted from the barrel. But the bullet didn't hit Gerald Ford. It whizzed past his head, missing him by inches, literally 5 or 6 inches, and slammed into the wall of the hotel, sending a spray of concrete dust into the air. A taxi driver nearby was struck by a fragment, bleeding but alive. Why did she miss? The gun she was using had a faulty sight. She had bought it in haste. At 40 feet, the error was significant. But she was not done. She prepared to fire again. This time she adjusted her aim. She had the rhythm now. She knew the kick of the weapon. Ford was frozen for a microsecond, a deer in the headlights, his eyes locking onto the puff of smoke. The agents were moving, but they were slow. The second shot was coming. And this is where the story descends into true tragedy, where the noir elements of the 1970s consume the narrative. Standing next to Sarah Jane Moore in the crowd was a man named Oliver Sipple. He was 33 years old, a former U.S. Marine who had seen combat in Vietnam. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with the instinctive reflexes of a soldier who has lived through the jungle. When he saw the gun, he didn't think. He didn't analyze the politics. He acted. As Moore's finger tightened on the trigger for the second and likely fatal shot, Sipple lunged. He grabbed her arm. His large hand enveloped the weapon. He wrestled it downward. Bang! The second shot went into the pavement, ricocheting harmlessly away. The Secret Service swarmed. Ford was shoved violently, ungracefully, his head nearly hitting the doorframe, into the back of the limousine. The cavalcade screeched away, sirens wailing, leaving behind a chaotic scene of screaming civilians and tackled assassins. Gerald Ford was alive. He had survived 2 assassination attempts in 17 days. The survivor had cheated the Reaper again. But for Oliver Sipple, the nightmare was just beginning. In a sane world, Oliver Sipple would have been celebrated as a national hero. He would have been given a medal, a parade, and the gratitude of a nation. And initially, that's what happened. The press hailed him. Marine saves president. He was the toast of San Francisco. But Oliver Sipple had a secret. He was gay. In 1975, San Francisco was the center of the burgeoning gay rights movement, led by figures like Harvey Milk. But in the rest of America, and specifically in the conservative working-class Detroit suburbs where Sipple's family lived, homosexuality was still viewed as a sin, a mental illness, a shame to be hidden at all costs. Sipple was out in San Francisco, living his truth in the Castro district, but he was closeted to his family back home. He lived a quiet life, afraid of rejection, maintaining a delicate balance between his 2 worlds. Harvey Milk, however, saw an opportunity. He saw a political weapon. He believed that if the world knew a gay man had saved the president, it would shatter the stereotype of gay men as weak, deviant, or predatory. It would prove they could be heroes. It would prove they were patriots. It was a noble political goal, a grand strategy for civil rights, but it required a human sacrifice. And Oliver Sipple was the sacrifice. Milk leaked the information to Herb Cohn, the famous columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. The headline ran the next day. The news exploded nationally. Hero is gay. The reaction was a visceral gut punch to Sipple. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. He hadn't asked to be outed. He had just reacted to a gun. The White House, terrified of associating with a homosexual figure in an election year, went silent. There was no Rose Garden ceremony. There was no phone call from the president, at least not immediately. Ford sent a brief, generic letter of thanks weeks later. The silence was deafening. It was a political calculation, a cold act of distancing that mirrored the way society treated men like Sipple. But the real blow came from home. Sipple's mother, a devout Baptist in Michigan, read the news. She was humiliated. When Oliver called her, desperate to explain, desperate for a connection, she hung up on him. His father told the neighbors to stop asking about his son. His brothers stopped speaking to him. The family he had tried to protect from his truth disowned him because of his heroism. The act of saving the president had cost him the people he loved most. Sipple sued the newspapers for invasion of privacy. He argued that his sexual orientation had nothing to do with grabbing a gun. The court ruled against him. They stated that his sexuality was now newsworthy because it challenged stereotypes. He had become a public figure involuntarily. He lost his privacy, his family, and his dignity in one stroke. The flaw wasn't Sippel's, it was society's. It was the media's ruthless need for a better story. The narrative of hero Marine was boring. The narrative of gay hero outed was sensational. It sold papers. Sippel began to drink. He drank to numb the pain of rejection. He drank to forget the mother who wouldn't speak to him. He spiraled into schizophrenia and severe alcoholism. He became bloated, paranoid, and lonely, a shadow of the Marine who had reacted so quickly on that September day. In 1989, 14 years after he saved the leader of the free world, Oliver Sippel was found dead in his cheap apartment in San Francisco. He had been dead for 2 weeks before anyone noticed. The only thing beside his body was a half-empty bottle of bourbon. He was 47 years old. Among his possessions, pinned to the wall of his squalid room, was the framed letter from the White House. It was the only tangible proof that he had done something good. This remains the darkest irony of the Ford presidency, a story that transcends politics and becomes a meditation on the cruelty of fate. Gerald Ford, the man who survived everything, the violent father, the typhoon, the political suicide, the 2 assassins, survived because of Oliver Sippel. Ford lived to be 93, dying peacefully in his bed, surrounded by a loving family, honored as a statesman. Sippel, the savior, died alone in squalor, destroyed by the very act of saving him. It is a story that fits the dark nostalgia theme perfectly. It exposes the rot beneath the surface of American heroism. It asks the philosophical question, what is the price of a life? And who pays it? Back in Washington, the mood following the attempts was grim. The klutz jokes stopped briefly, replaced by a sense of fragility. The Secret Service tightened the bubble. Ford began wearing a bulletproof vest under his shirts every day. It was hot, uncomfortable, and humiliating. It made him look bulky and stiff, further fueling the awkward perception in the media. But he wore it. He kept traveling. He kept shaking hands. If we can't go out, Ford told his aides, then we are prisoners in the White House. And if we are prisoners, then the terrorists have won. He was stubborn. He was the center on the football team who kept snapping the ball even when his nose was broken. He was the officer on the deck of the Monterey refusing to abandon ship. But something had changed. The joy was gone. The presidency had become a siege. The season of the assassin had revealed that the country was not just angry, it was sick. The fever that began with Kennedy in Dallas had not broken. It had just mutated. As 1975 turned into the election year of 1976, Ford looked tired. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the Democrats who smelled blood in the water, and against the ghosts of violence that seemed to follow him. He was a man walking through a minefield waiting for the click. He had survived the bullets. But could he survive the voters? The survivor was about to face his final and most brutal test, the judgment of the American people. The year 1976 should have been a victory lap for the American experiment. It was the bicentennial, the 200th birthday of the Republic. The skies over New York Harbor were lit up with fireworks. Tall ships sailed up the Hudson. The Liberty Bell was struck. It was a year designed for pageantry, a year for a president to stand tall and bask in the glow of national endurance. But for Gerald Ford, the bicentennial wasn't a party. It was a wake. The country was celebrating its history, but it despised its present. The balloons and streamers couldn't hide the fact that the inflation rate was eating paychecks alive, or that the memory of helicopters fleeing Saigon was still burning in the national retina. Ford stood on the reviewing stands, smiling that fixed, stoic smile, but he was a man under siege. He was the host of a party where none of the guests wanted him there. The first knife in his back didn't come from the Democrats. It came from his own family. In the winter of 1976, the Republican Party descended into a fratricidal war that shattered the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican. The challenger was Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, a man who possessed everything Ford lacked: charisma, a clear ideological vision, and the ability to speak in poetry rather than prose. Reagan painted Ford not as the savior of the party, but as a squish, a caretaker, a man who had sold out conservatism to get along with Washington. The primary battle was brutal. It was a street fight for the soul of the party. Ford, the sitting president, had to beg for delegates. He had to use the patronage of his office, inviting wavering delegates to the White House for dinners, essentially buying their loyalty with the trappings of power. It was humiliating for a man who prided himself on dignity. He scraped by, winning the nomination by a razor-thin margin in Kansas City. He had survived the mutiny, but the ship was leaking. He entered the general election against Jimmy Carter, damaged, exhausted, and bleeding political capital. Jimmy Carter was the perfect storm to sink Gerald Ford. The former governor of Georgia was an enigma, a peanut farmer with a nuclear engineering background, a devout Christian with a toothy grin, and a complete outsider to Washington. In the post-Watergate ruins, Carter's lack of experience was his greatest asset. He ran on a platform of aggressive morality. "I will never lie to you," he told the crowds. It was a direct indictment of the pardon. Every time Carter smiled, he was reminding the voters that Ford had let Nixon go. Ford trailed by 30 points in the polls. He was dead in the water. But then the survivor instinct kicked in. Ford campaigned with a ferocity that stunned the press. He attacked Carter's vagueness. He utilized the Rose Garden strategy, looking presidential while Carter looked like a novice. Slowly, painfully, the gap began to close. By October, it was a dead heat. The accidental president was on the verge of pulling off the greatest comeback in political history. And then came the fatal flaw. The date was October 6th, 1976. The setting was the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, the second televised presidential debate. The topic was foreign policy, Ford's strong suit. He had met Brezhnev. He had navigated the Cold War. Carter was a novice on the world stage. This was supposed to be the moment Ford put the nail in the coffin. The moderator, Max Frankel of the New York Times, asked a question about the Soviet sphere of influence. It was a setup, a chance for Ford to denounce Soviet aggression. Ford leaned into the microphone. His voice was steady. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. It was a visceral moment of cognitive dissonance. Frankel, looking confused, asked a follow-up, giving the president a lifeline, a chance to correct himself. "I'm sorry, what? Did I understand you to say that the Russians are not using their power in Eastern Europe?" Any other politician would have pivoted. They would have said, "I meant that we do not accept their domination morally." But Ford, the stubborn mule of Michigan, the man who believed that if he said something it must be true, doubled down. "I don't believe," Ford insisted, "that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union." It was a hallucination on live television. Soviet tanks were in the streets of Warsaw. The Iron Curtain was a physical reality of concrete and barbed wire. People were dying trying to cross it. And the President of the United States was standing there, stone-faced, denying the existence of the geopolitical gravity of the era. Why did he say it? It wasn't stupidity, it was a psychological block. Ford had just signed the Helsinki Accords, which he believed opened the door for human rights in those countries. He wanted to believe that the American spirit was alive there. He refused to concede the soul of those nations to the Soviets. But to the viewer at home, watching on grainy color TVS, he looked like a man who had lost his mind. He looked detached from reality. The Klutz narrative returned with a vengeance. This time, he hadn't tripped on a stair. He had tripped on the map of the world. The momentum of the campaign smashed into a brick wall. For days, Ford refused to retract the statement. He was angry. He felt he was being misunderstood. By the time he finally issued a clarification, the damage was calcified. The comeback kid had shot himself in the foot. Election night, November 2nd, 1976, was a slow agony. The results trickled in. It was tight, tighter than anyone expected. But as the night wore on, the blue wall of the South and the Northeast held for Carter. Ford lost. The count was 297 electoral votes to 240. The popular vote margin was barely 2%. The next morning, the cameras gathered in the White House briefing room. The tragedy of the moment was palpable. Ford entered looking like a man who had been hollowed out. He stood at the podium, opened his mouth to concede, and nothing came out. His voice was gone. The vocal cords that had shouted orders on the Monterey and negotiated bills in the House had finally failed him. He was overcome with emotion, physically unable to speak the words of defeat. In a moment of profound tenderness that presaged the next chapter of their lives, Betty Ford stepped up. She took the speech from his hand. With a clear, strong voice, she read his concession. She was the strength. He was the silence. The survivor had finally lost. The man who wasn't supposed to be president was now the man who used to be president. The transition was abrupt. On January 20th, 1977, Ford rode with Carter to the Capitol. He watched the inauguration, and then he got on a helicopter and flew away. There is a specific kind of death that happens when a president leaves office. The phone stops ringing. The entourage vanishes. The nuclear codes are taken away by a military aide. You are suddenly just a citizen again. The Fords moved to Rancho Mirage, California, to a compound in the desert. They were supposed to play golf. They were supposed to rest. But the dark nostalgia of the 1970s had one last twist for them. The demons that had been kept at bay by the adrenaline of the White House were waiting in the quiet of the desert. Gerald Ford adjusted to retirement with his usual stoicism. He joined corporate boards. He gave speeches. He made money. But Betty Ford was disintegrating. The rigid code of the Ford family, the silence, the repression of emotion, the need to maintain appearances, could no longer contain the reality of Betty's addiction. For years, she had been self-medicating. A pinched nerve in her neck gave her the excuse for opioids. The loneliness of political wifehood gave her the excuse for alcohol. In the White House, the staff had covered for her. "Mrs. Ford is tired," they would say when she slurred her words or stumbled at a state dinner. But in the desert, there was nowhere to hide. She was drinking vodka in the morning. She was taking pills by the handful. She was sleepwalking through life, a ghost in her own home. Ford, the man who noticed everything on a football field, was in deep denial. He loved her, but he didn't know how to fix this. He tried to ignore it, hoping his stability would be enough to anchor her. It wasn't. In April 1978, the family reached a breaking point. Their daughter, Susan, organized an intervention. It was a radical concept at the time. They gathered in the living room. Ford sat there, uncomfortable, terrified of the emotional intimacy. One by one, The children read letters to their mother. They told her she was killing herself. They told her they were scared. Then it was Jerry's turn. The former president of the United States, the man who had pardoned Nixon to heal the nation, looked at his wife. He was weeping. He told her he loved her too much to watch her die. It was the most courageous act of his life. It was harder than the typhoon. It was harder than the assassins. It was the moment he finally stopped pretending that everything was fine. Betty went to rehab at Long Beach Naval Hospital. She didn't just go, she went public. In a world where addiction was a dirty secret, especially for women, she threw open the doors. She said, "I am an alcoholic. I am an addict." The impact was seismic. It was arguably greater than anything Gerald Ford achieved in the Oval Office. By admitting her weakness, she gave permission to millions of Americans to seek help. She founded the Betty Ford Center in 1982. It became the most famous addiction treatment facility in the world. There is a profound irony here. Gerald Ford spent his life trying to be the healer, healing the wounds of Watergate, healing the economy. But history remembers him as a placeholder. It was his wife, the damaged one, the one he tried to protect, who became the true healer of the American psyche. Her legacy of recovery outshone his legacy of pardon. But Ford didn't mind. In his post-presidency, a softness entered him. The armor of the survivor began to crack, revealing a grandfatherly warmth. He watched with pride as Betty became a national icon. He realized that his job was no longer to lead the country, but to support the woman who was saving it, one addict at a time. He also found an unlikely friend, Jimmy Carter. The man who had defeated him, the man who had called him a failure, became his closest companion. They traveled together to elections in foreign countries. They debated. They laughed. It was a symbol of what Ford had always wanted, a world where political opponents didn't have to be enemies. It was a vindication of his decency. As the decades passed, the anger of 1974 faded. The klutz jokes stopped being funny and started feeling mean-spirited. Historians began to look at the papers. They saw the impossible hand he had been dealt. They saw a man who took a broken country and handed it over to Carter in one piece. They saw the integrity of the pardon. In 1999, Bill Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. To Gerald Ford, the citation read, "who guided the nation through its greatest constitutional crisis." He had survived long enough to hear the verdict of history change. He had outlived the critics. He had outlived the assassins. He had outlived the shame. But time is the one assassin that never misses. In 2006, at the age of 93, the body that had survived the gridiron, the ocean, and the bullet began to fail. He was the oldest living president. He was the last link to the Warren Commission, the last link to the smoke-filled rooms of the old Congress. He lay in his bed in Rancho Mirage, the desert sun casting long shadows across the floor. He looked back on the strange, winding path of his life. The boy named Leslie King, the sailor on the burning deck, the congressman who moved the bullet, the president who wasn't elected, the man who fell down the stairs, the man who forgave Nixon. He closed his eyes. The accidental Caesar was ready to rest. On the evening of December 26, 2006, the desert air in Rancho Mirage was cold and still. Inside the compound, the man who had once held the fate of the world in his large athletic hands took his final breath. Gerald R. Ford was dead at the age of 93. His passing was not marked by the chaotic upheaval that defined his birth, nor the violence that stalked his presidency. It was quiet. It was steady. It was, in a word, normal. And for a man whose life had been a lightning rod for the insanity of the 20th century, This peaceful end was the ultimate victory. The survivor had finally outlasted the storm. When the news broke, the reaction of the nation was unexpected. The ridicule of the 1970s was gone. The klutz jokes, the anger over the pardon, the bitterness of the election, it had all evaporated, leaving behind a sediment of profound respect. As his body was flown back to Washington to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, the country paused to look at the man again, and for the first time they saw him clearly. They didn't see a bumbler. They saw a man who had stood in the center of a burning building and refused to let it collapse. The funeral services closed the circle. The eulogies were delivered not just by his Republican allies, but by his fiercest rivals. Jimmy Carter, the man who had denied him a full term, stood in the pulpit and declared, "For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he did to heal our land." It was the closing of the circle. The wound of 1976 was healed. But the true weight of Gerald Ford's legacy requires us to look deeper, past the pageantry of the state funeral. What was the meaning of this accidental presidency? Gerald Ford was the great anomaly of American history. He was the only man to occupy the White House without a single vote. This fact, which haunted him every day of his tenure, is actually the key to his greatness. Because he wasn't elected, he wasn't beholden to the seductive narcissism of the ballot box. He didn't need to be loved, he only needed to be useful. He was the designated mourner for the death of American innocence. He came to power at the precise moment when the United States realized it was not infallible. We had lost a war in Vietnam. We had lost our moral compass in Watergate. We were running out of gas, literally and metaphorically. Any other politician possessed by ego or grand vision might have tried to crusade his way out of that hole and torn the country apart in the process. Ford didn't crusade. He coped. He was the shock absorber. He took the impact of the pardon, the impact of the recession, and the impact of the cultural rage, and he absorbed it into his own political body so the institutions wouldn't shatter. His life story leaves us with one final, uncomfortable truth. Ford was a man of secrets. He carried the secret of the Warren Commission, the moving of the bullet, to his grave, believing that a comforting lie was better than a chaotic truth. He carried the burden of the Nixon pardon, knowing it looked like corruption but believing it was salvation. He was a man who believed that sometimes, for the family to survive, the father has to bury the skeletons in the backyard and never speak of them again. Was he a great president? In the conventional sense of Lincoln or FDR, perhaps not. He conquered no armies. He passed no New Deal. But he was a good man. And in the blood-soaked, paranoid, cynical landscape of the 1970s, being a good man was a radical, almost revolutionary act. His life was defined by the burden of decency in an indecent time. He was too honest for the press, too loyal for the politicians, and too forgiving for the voters. But that flaw was also his salvation. It allowed him to sleep at night. It allowed him to look in the mirror and see Gerald Ford, not the ghost of Leslie King. Consider the margins of his life. The 2 inches of steel on the deck of the Monterey, the empty chamber in Squeaky Fromm's gun, the 6 inches of air that saved him from Sarah Jane Moore, the razor-thin margin of the 1976 election. Gerald Ford lived his entire life on the edge of the cliff. Any other man would have fallen, but Ford had balance. Not the physical balance of a dancer, but the moral balance of a stoic. He kept his footing when the world was tilting on its axis. As the caisson carried his body through the streets of Washington, the dark nostalgia of the era felt complete. The 1970s were truly over. The nightmares of Watergate and Vietnam were fading into history books. The accidental Caesar had done his job. He had held the bridge. History will remember him not for what he conquered, but for what he survived. He was the scar tissue on the heart of America, tough, fibrous, and unpretty, but absolutely necessary for the wound to close. The man who wasn't supposed to be there had turned out to be the only one who could have been there. In the end, the ghost of Leslie King, the violent father with the butcher knife, never caught him. The typhoon didn't drown him. The bullet didn't pierce him. Gerald Ford walked off the stage on his own terms, leaving behind a country that was bruised, battered, but still standing. And for a survivor, that is enough.